Hello everyone. In today's lecture, we will be examining the history of women in the First World War. In the decades preceding the war, women around the world had been fighting for the right to vote and participate actively in politics in a wave of dissent often referred to as First Wave Feminism. In this lecture, we shall sweep across Europe during the war, looking at the ways in which women in a number of different countries continued their struggle for a political voice whilst actively contributing to their nation's individual war efforts. In Britain, the issue of votes for women had been one of the three hot topic political issues before the war, along with Irish Home Rule and the status of the House of Lords. British women's rights activists organised in the Women's Social Political Union were known as either suffragettes or suffragists, depending on the level of direct action in which they espoused. They grabbed headlines with the series of daring stunts that they performed to gain attention for their cause. Some of the more radical suffragettes even resorted to bombing letterboxes, and Emily Davison famously threw herself in front of the King's horse at the Epsom Derby in 1913. Thousands of people lined Davison's funeral in London, and it seemed like the women's right to vote would soon be granted. Then the war broke out, and the WSPU immediately switched to a policy of nationalism and cancelled their most radical actions in order to support the war effort. This was possible thanks to the close level of control that Christabel and Emmeline Pankhurst had over the movement. The WSPU changed the name of their journal to the patriotic-sounding Britannica and issued nationalist speeches warning against the German peril. Incredibly, they even supported the White Feather movement, whereby women would shame British men who had not enlisted in the war by giving them white feathers, marking them out to be cowards. Many feathers were given to wounded veterans or even to currently enlisted men on leave in civilian clothing. Despite its over-the-top nationalism, the WSPU did continue to advocate for equal pay, new divorce laws, maternity and infant care. In 1917, it was dissolved and replaced by the so-called Women's Party, which directly conflated the twin aims of winning the war and earning women the vote. Away from politics, however, millions of ordinary women were experiencing great changes in their lives, changes which would fundamentally alter British society. Tens of thousands of women served as nurses in France and Belgium, where they witnessed the horrors of war firsthand. 1 million women also worked in producing munitions for the front lines. They earned the nickname Canaries due to the yellow color that the chemicals in the bombs made their skin. The production of munitions was not only dangerous, but was long and boring at the best of times. Women were also hired as clerks, drivers, and teachers, everywhere replacing male workers sent to the front. This was the first time that many of the women, particularly middle-class women, had ever drawn an independent salary. Their strong performance challenged many of the previous stereotypes, which said that women were unsuited for skilled or for dangerous employment. It goes without saying that in all of their jobs, the British women were paid less than their male counterparts had been. In France, the government called upon women to work in the fields of this still mostly rural country. This resulted in little changes for peasant women who had already laboured in the fields beside their husbands before the war. Special workshops and schools were founded to train French women in a trade, but the number of female industrial workers in the cities continued to lag behind the UK and Germany. In occupied France, women played an important role in the resistance, coordinating raids and espionage behind the German front lines. Female spies and saboteurs captured by the Germans were treated especially harshly. Overall, concerns that the French population was dropping and that the French were dying off delayed the progress of women's rights in the country, and losses of young French men during the war only increased the mania for women to remain home and have children. Women in Austria were called up to do their duty to the emperor and to give up many of the luxuries that they had supposedly enjoyed before the war. Given the starvation on the home front, women in Vienna suffered a daily battle to gather food for their families. Middle-class societies sprung up to donate valuables in order to buy food and redistribute it to the poor. Interestingly, the political General Austrian Women's Association opposed the war for the suffering that it had brought. Victoria Savs was an Austrian woman who disguised herself as a man and joined the Habsburg army aged just 15. Later nicknamed the Heroine of the Three Peaks, Savs earned numerous medals for bravery fighting the Italians before her secret was revealed and she was sent home. Middle-class women in Germany were organized into the Union of German Women's Associations, which called for women's equality and greater access to education. Working-class women usually joined socialist organizations that pressed for improvements in women's healthcare and education. Just like in Britain, the outbreak of World War I abruptly put an end to the activities of the suffrage activists and the socialists. The bourgeois and proletarian women's movements supported the war effort on the so-called home front. Volunteers worked in public welfare, organized cooking courses, and ensured the care of families, maternity, and babies. The volunteerism of the German women apparently went unnoticed by the Kaiser, who declared that all working-class men could have the vote as a result of their sacrifices, but made no mention of women. In both the middle and working-class women's movements, not all women supported the war. The socialist pacifists used the journal Equality, published by Clara Zetkin, as a mouthpiece against the war. However, this journal was strictly censored. In March 1915, Zetkin formed an international conference of socialist women against the war in Switzerland, attended by 70 delegates from 8 different countries. The resolution adopted at the conference, War on this War, resulted in Zetkin being arrested for treason and the conference report being completely censored. Anita Augsburg and leader Gustava Heimann also resolutely campaigned for an early peace. Their goal was an international women's initiative to collectively end the World War. The pair organized an international women's conference against the war together with the American Nobel Peace Prize laureate Jane Addams. At the conference, which was attended by more than 1,000 women from 12 different countries, the International Women's Committee for Lasting Peace was founded. After the conference, the German participants were considered by the government traitors to the fatherland. The Islamic Organization for the Employment of Women was founded in the Ottoman Empire as a way to allow women to work in the wartime factories without breaking Islamic principles. For the first time in Turkish history, women had access to white-collar jobs in the Ottoman bureaucracy, even as they continued to be denied further influence in government. Rural women, in contrast, suffered greatly due to the collapse of authority in parts of the empire, with many being left defending their homes and families by themselves. To earn any pension for their fallen husbands, women had to petition the authorities and describe in detail the way their husbands had fallen in battle. If the case was considered valorous enough, a pension was granted. Reading these heartbreaking petitions provides an insight into the pain felt by widowed wives across the continent. The Russian Provisional Government, which assumed power following the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas in 1917, famously made use of women in a combat role. The Provisional Government hoped that the creation of female military units would increase morale by shaming the male soldiers of the Russian army to fight harder. Numerous units were trained, including the wonderfully named 1st Russian Women's Battalion of Death, which saw action against the Germans and fought well. The 1st Petrograd Women's Battalion was the final group of soldiers in the city that defended the Provisional Government against the Bolsheviks in the October Revolution. They were overwhelmed by the Bolshevik forces and surrendered. Meanwhile, women serving at the front were sent home as men feared that their enthusiasm for battle would prolong the hated war. In Serbia, the numerous wars in the country had resulted in a greatly unbalanced population with far more female citizens than men. What's more, Serbia was entirely conquered by its enemies during the war, blurring the lines between the home front and the front line. As a result, numerous women fought with distinction in the Serbian army. One, Milunka Savic, even captured 23 Bulgarian soldiers single-handedly. After the retreat of the Serbian army and leadership from their country, a census showed just 69 men for every 100 women. Marriages became rare, and children born out of wedlock dramatically increased in number. In Finland, communist women formed and fought in the so-called female Red Guards, where most died in massacres perpetrated by the Finnish whites during the civil war in that country. Everywhere soldiers went, sex work industries sprung up to cater for the men. When British soldiers set off for the trenches in 1914, folded inside each of their paybooks was the message, "You may find temptation in both in women and in wine. You must entirely resist both." This message was ignored, and lines of soldiers were seen snaking round brothels throughout French and Belgian towns. For many soldiers, who were usually young men between 16 and 19, encounters with a French prostitute was the first sexual experience of their lives. No one wanted to risk dying a virgin. Others had loved ones at home, but visited the brothels nonetheless. Venereal disease was an ever-present risk, but one that some soldiers embraced, as treatment would mean a break from the horrors of the front lines. On the darker side of things, sexual violence ruined lives throughout occupied Europe. Treatment following such acts was made difficult due to traditional systems of morality, which stifled important conversations. Women earned the right to vote in most European and North American countries following the conclusion of the war. In Canada, Austria, Germany, Poland, the Netherlands, the US, Sweden, the UK, and in Ireland. German women have the right to vote. It is something completely new, incomprehensible, something like a miracle, said German feminist Maria Stritt. In many of these countries, women's extensive sacrifices during the war were invoked as the reason for the constitutional changes. However, many times it was only older or propertied women who could vote, with sexist and ageist images of women continuing to hold sway in many countries. Turkey, France, and Italy were all slower to allow women the right to vote, and Switzerland did not grant this right until as late as 1971. In Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk saw rights for women as an important part of his modernization efforts in the country. As well as earning the right to vote, women in Turkey also benefited from the banning of polygamy and the equalization of divorce law. In France, the driving concern in the 1920s and 30s continued to be getting women to have more children for the fatherland. Government money, for example, was given to women staying at home and having children in order to supplement a father's income. In Italy, women lost many of the tenuous rights that they had fought for once Mussolini seized power. Everywhere across Europe, sexism continued. As men returned home from the front, they pushed women back into the home, a particularly acute problem between 1919 and 1924, as European economies struggled to deal with a contraction of demand and the subsequent mass unemployment that followed. Birth control was still limited, and abortion remained a taboo. Yet the cat was, to an extent, now out of the bag. Women had experienced a broadening of their horizons and now pushed for a more active role both on the factory floor and in universities and law courts. The Second World War would see women once again keep their countries running through their sacrifices, paving the way for the battle against more subtle forms of discrimination in the 1960s with second wave feminism.